Before I start today's episode, I don't want to be somebody that bashes police for not working hard enough to solve cases. I know that policing, especially when it comes to homicide and sex crimes, is hard. And I know that at least in the United States, there are a lot of small towns and rural communities with very small police departments that are used to more petty crimes, neighborhood disputes, thefts, places where major crimes don't happen very often. But I think the lesson in today's story is that when they do happen, that it's okay to admit that you're in over your head and maybe call in the big guns right away. So I am not anti-police, anything like that. I greatly respect the work of detectives everywhere. I know that it is a hard and very thankless job. But with that, this is the murder of Jessica Dishon. Jessica Dishon was born May 2nd, 1982, to parents 17-year-old Edna and Mike Dishon in the rural community of Shepherdsville, Kentucky, which is part of Bullitt County, so just 20 miles from Louisville. And Jessica had been described as a very responsible girl. She had goals to go on to university after high school to study accounting, which makes her a girl after my own heart because spreadsheets are totally my thing. In September of 1999, so when she was 17 years old, and from all accounts, just a very typical teenager, she was in her last year of high school. She's a good looking brunette. She's 5'4", about 112 pounds, and she's got that 90s hair, long and wavy, big bangs. She looked to be about the same as about 70% of the girls that I went to high school with in the yearbook photos. Shepherdsville is a very small community. There's not a lot for teenagers to do, so like teens usually do, with her and her boyfriend and some friends from school, would sometimes gather in like a wooded area or abandoned farm lots to have parties. But for the most part, Jessica was a really good kid. She took her schooling and her goals that she had very seriously. On September 10th, 1999, Edna and Mike were up early that morning. Their normal routine was that Edna and Mike would get up around 5:30 and then wake Jessica's younger brothers, Bubby and Chris, and Edna would leave for work first, and Mike would make sure that the boys caught the school bus, and then he would head to work. So that morning, they left Jessica to sleep in because she normally left for school around 6:30. She had a car, so she could get her there herself and get off to school on her own. At around 1 o'clock, Edna returned home from grocery shopping and saw that Jessica's Pontiac, she had a red Pontiac, it was still parked in the driveway. So she goes inside and starts calling for Jessica, thinking maybe she wasn't feeling well, and that, or maybe she had come home from school early. And when she doesn't find her, she calls Mike at work and asks if he took her to school that morning. And he said no, but check her car and see if maybe if the car starts, like maybe she had car trouble. So when Edna opens the driver's side door, like her heart just stops at that moment. On the driver's side seat is her purse. Her wallet is still there. Her school backpack, her cell phone's there. There's one tennis shoe on the floor of the car, like laying kind of near the brake pedal. But most alarming of all is that her cell phone has 9 and then a 1 entered on the screen. And Edna had said at that time, quote, "It's like I couldn't breathe and I just knew something was wrong." And I think that would freak anyone out, especially her mom. Like, this is a huge red flag that she was obviously trying to call 911. So Edna called the school and discovered that Jessica had never been to school that day at all. Now, in my neck of the woods, the high school would call me if one of my kids didn't show up for school, but I guess this was a different time. And Mike immediately, he came home from work knowing something bad had happened. And they called around everywhere that they can think of after learning that Jessica had not only did she not show up for work, she hadn't, or for school, she hadn't shown up for work after school, which she worked at Hardee's. About 5 o'clock, she was expected there, and she hadn't shown up. So they headed to the police department, and then the detective at the front desk, like, they wouldn't even let them make a report. He said that she probably just ran away, come back tomorrow if they didn't hear from her. And Mike's like, He says, quote, "She ain't no runaway with one shoe off and one shoe on." Now, anyone that's familiar with small towns knows that the police departments, they, I mean, obviously they don't deal a lot with kidnappings and sex crimes and murders, if they ever have encountered them at all. So I don't think there would have been any shame in saying like that they were in over their heads, maybe asking the state police to come in and kind of help with these cases, because they'd have a little bit more experience, more resources, but that never happened. And I can't imagine knowing in your heart that something bad has happened, and that obviously time is of the essence, and then not being able to get any help. So the next morning, after a sleepless night, as soon as the police station opened, they were right back there. Like, how anybody can listen to the story of parents with the phone call the way it was and one shoe left behind, her purse left behind, decide that she ran away is beyond me. Especially the cell phone and the shoe. I mean, teenagers, I guess I could see them running away with a shoe, but her cell phone and her purse, like, there's no way. And even still, she's still a minor. So even if she did run away, like, wouldn't you still want to go look for her? So that next day, they did send out 2 officers. One of them was a rookie detective named Dave Greenwell. Now, he did investigate the car, but he touched all the evidence with his bare hands. Um, Now, there are reports that this officer Greenwell did reach out to Sheriff Paul Parsley, with his concerns that this was a missing persons case that needed to kind of be investigated. But he was told that nope, she was a runaway, and he was not given permission to impound the car. So, other than looking in the car and touching everything, the 2 officers just left, went back to the police station. Now, Mike Dishon says that no one ever looked for Jessica except for people in the community. The family had to organize their own search party with family and friends, and the media coverage at the time. So the next day, they're out interviewing the parents who were, I mean, they were pretty vocal even by this point about their frustrations with the police, but still the police would not search. And people don't really go missing in Shepherdville. I mean, everyone knows everyone in this little town. So I can't even make excuses for the police department here. So during the search, Mike and his brother Stanley were talking together about where she could possibly be and where they should kind of go and look for her. And at this point, the family just has a really terrible feeling that they are pretty much discussing that they should be looking for her body. And Stanley suggests that, well, if somebody did something to her, they should try looking in the river bottoms. Now, the river bottoms is a term of low-lying land close along rivers. The term is used mostly in the south parts of the U.S., like Kentucky and Mississippi. Hopefully that's right, but somebody will correct me if I'm wrong about that. Basically, they are creepy, dark areas all along riverways. Um, we live really close to a river where I am, and there are lots of places that I always tell my husband that we should be on the lookout for dead bodies. Wooded areas near water, I mean, that's probably where I would look too. The river bottoms was very secluded because it was known as an area that you did not want to go to. If bad stuff was taking place in Shepherdville and the surrounding area, it's going to be happening at the river bottoms. So while searching the area, hits Stanley that they are looking for the dead body of his niece. And he becomes so overwhelmed, that he gets sick. So they have to take him home. They stop searching soon after that because they're just not finding anything. And this search that the family had to do by themselves is just really, really hard on them because they should not be the ones that have to, um, organize their own search. And then, of course, it really shouldn't be on families to find their person. So the next night, Edna and Mike are washing dishes. They're just trying to do whatever they can to keep busy. And their youngest son, Chris, comes running in through the backyard and says that he thinks that he heard Jessica calling for help. So Mike runs out of the house he's got a shotgun on him, and he runs into Stanley, who's pulling into the driveway. And of course, Stanley sees Mike running with this shotgun and it's like, what's happening? So they all go setting off to look for where this voice could be coming from. And they see in the distance in one of their neighbors' yards was the fire that was going, and somebody's standing over this fire pit burning something that looks like clothes. Now, the Dishon's neighbor, Irene and David, who's known as Bucky Brooks, had been neighbors for quite a number of years. There were conflicting reports about how the relationship as neighbors was going. Um, at the time of Jessica's disappearance, some say it was fine and others say it was not so great. Now, but from what I could kind of track down on Bucky, he was a bit of an asshole neighbor. Pictures of the property look pretty run down, a bit hoarded. But what I did find was a YouTube channel from 2015 that was pretty much dedicated to filming Bucky and Irene being assholes.
Get your vehicle out of the way so I can clean up your mess.
I ain't moving nothing. He wants our vehicle moved out of the way so he clean up our nasty ass mess.
Well, what he can do, let me tell you what he can do. I'll tell you what he can do. Or the road up there and go around over and back up here.
I can't be responsible if you won't move your vehicle.
Well, if you run into it, that's fine. I'll get the cops back down here because you tore down my satellite dish.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Now, I got your fingerprints.
Okay.
What's the cop's number? 348 what?
I'm just trying to get property cleaned up that you trashed up. If you don't mind, please move.
Now you go up by that driveway and come around back down here.
Just neighborhood tirade type stuff, threatening to call the cops for something or other. Seems like he wasn't particularly well liked in the community. He wasn't known for being the most educated or classy of types. So Mike asks if they can search his property, and he says no. So Mike and Edna suspect that he knows something about Jessica's disappearance because, in addition to this suspicious burning that was going on, he was also one of the only neighbors that had ever said no to them searching the property for Jessica. So the Dishons contact the sheriff's department, and Sheriff Paul Parsley comes out with another officer and a cadaver dog. And they search the property of Bucky's with a warrant, including the barn, the house, and all of the fields. And the only thing that they can find is a partially burnt pair of gloves in this fire pit that the dog did sort of hit on. Cadaver dogs are trained to sit if they encounter like the smell of decomposition. But they did not make an arrest of Bucky at that time, and that really upset Mike. So he called the FBI and invited them to come and join the investigation because he just didn't feel like the local police were doing enough, well, or anything really for that matter. Sheriff Parsley even said that Brooks was acting weird and smug during this search, but they didn't do anything about it. They didn't even bring him in for questioning. So the FBI came in, they launched this massive search, including like helicopters and everything. They impounded Bucky's car, searched Jessica's room, impounded Jessica's car as well. They took fingerprints, they set to work finding Jessica, basically doing police work, including they offered a $18,000 reward for information regarding her abduction, but they still didn't have her body or any signs of her. 17 days later, on September 27th, there was a bus driver, Karen Hobbs. She was driving from Mount Washington along River Bottom Road. She called 911 after spotting something under a tree. Now, so along the Salt River in Mount Washington, so 7 miles from their house, Jessica's unrecognizable, badly decomposing body was found sitting up against a tree. Her pants were halfway down. There was a rope with traces of red, silver, and gray paint with it around her leg, which they believed was used to drag her body. One of her feet had been cut off, and some of her fingers were gone. 15 feet away from her, they found some hair and body fluids. It was likely blood that had shown that she had been dragged through the soil. So Edna had just absolutely brutal and agonizing job of going down to the crime scene to see if it was Jessica. And Edna had to actually, this is so sad. She had to actually get down on her knees and examine her because she just couldn't tell from how badly damaged her face was, but she was able to identify her class ring, a necklace that she had with a necklace that she had, and her butterfly tattoo. And then, of course, dental records were able to confirm what Edna already knew. And the autopsy showed that she was probably killed about 3 days after she disappeared. Her jaw had been broken and she was beaten prior to her death. The actual cause of death was strangulation. There was no evidence of any kind of sexual assault other than how her clothes were found, but that could have been from dragging her body. The FBI knew that all the signs were pointing to the fact that the killer had placed her there wanting her to be found, because she was not there during the initial search. They know that for sure. The Dishons were pissed because they had begged the police to do more than just do a cursory look for her from the day one, and she was obviously still alive at that time and could have maybe been saved if they had just taken the case a little bit more seriously and gone to look for her. And it was reported as saying, "Now you go tell me she's a damn runaway," and I really don't blame them for being angry. I would be really angry myself. So the FBI went back to Bucky's house to question him. Now, initially, when he was first interviewed, he had said that he saw her the day that she disappeared. She was walking towards the high school. He was helping his dad with his water business, that their family ran, and he was driving by. He saw her. But on this day that he's questioned, his story changed a little bit, and he said that he never saw her at all, that he was busy having sex with his wife. Now, his wife actually did not corroborate that story. So, in an interrogation tactic where they kind of allude to having some evidence that they don't actually have in order to kind of shake him up, they asked him what they would do or what he would do if they had found his fingerprints on Jessica's body. And at that point, he was quoted as saying, "Well, if they did that, then he would have to admit to doing it." And so they took that as a confession. And then they gave him a lie detector test, which he did consent to, and he failed. Well, according to them, he failed. The police asked Bucky where he was that day, and he said that he was actually at work. And when the police tried to sort of confirm that story, they couldn't find anyone that was there with him at the time. There were several witnesses who said that they saw Bucky's van on the road that Jessica was eventually found on, in the days leading up to the discovery. So the police obtained a warrant for Brooks Farm, and once again they had this scent dog with them. And the scent dog led them to this farm, like a farm building, where the dog had found a school photo of Jessica. So the police also searched the work van that David drove, and there was some rope found in there. And the rope looked a little bit like the rope that had been found on Jessica. So things are not looking good for Bucky right now. So he was arrested and held in custody. And then 16 months after Jessica had disappeared, David Bucky Brooks was charged with capital murder and he was facing the death penalty. So that trial began in January of 2003, and the prosecution had primarily circumstantial evidence, but felt that they were prepared that this was going to be a slam dunk. Only the defense was pretty quickly able to sort of start to poke some holes in their theory, pointing out that, well, the investigation had been mishandled from the very beginning and that evidence had not been properly handled. Like, for example, her body parts that were left to rot in some boxes that had clearly been marked to keep frozen. They also had some alternative suspects that were able to testify, such as James Coulter. He was a local drug dealer that said that he saw Jessica 2 days after she disappeared. She bought some drugs from him. Now there was no reports that Jessica was ever a drug user, but they were basically going for this reasonable doubt theory. So I don't blame them for trying to bring this guy in. So Detective Charles Mann gets on the stand. Now he's the detective that was in charge of the initial investigation, if you can call it that, before the FBI got involved. And now he stated that Bucky was the last one to see her alive. So it has to be him. And he was hounded on the stand really badly for how they handled the investigation, like why they hadn't taken her disappearance seriously at first, and how could he be so sure that it was Bucky that had killed her. So after quite a bit of interrogation on the stand, he basically said that he didn't really know, but that he had failed the polygraph test that they had given to him. Now, here's the thing about polygraph tests. I mean, they're not admissible in court. I think most people know that, but like not at all. Like you cannot use a confession if you get one as the result of a failed exam. But in court, you can't even actually mention a polygraph or even allude to a polygraph. Like it is, if you do, it is an automatic mistrial. So right then and there, the trial is over. So Mike and Edna were, I mean, they were just crushed. They believed very strongly that Bucky had abducted and killed their little girl. It is what they were told had happened. So it was going to be up to the Commonwealth to decide whether or not they were going to bring new charges and start the trial all over again with new evidence, but they never did that. So Bucky was released. The state turned over all the boxes of evidence over to the family. Like it was basically saying, we're done this investigation. We're not going to do anything more with it. So the case was cold then for 10 years. And of course, there was this cloud of suspicion over Bucky the whole time. The Dishon family believed very strongly that Bucky was responsible. They were angry. They felt like they were never going to get justice. The strain on their marriage was a bit too much, so they divorced. Mike was quoted as saying, "I lost my kid. I lost my wife too." To this day, they still don't really talk to each other. So Mike Dishon stayed in the family home. He never changed Jessica's room from the day that she disappeared. And then in June of 2012, so 13 years after Jessica's murder, Detective Lynn Hunt was appointed as a new investigator in Bullitt County. She was supposed to investigate old cold cases. And she decided to reopen Jessica's case as a first order of business. But she had to start from scratch because the boxes of files, of all the evidence were just an absolutely mess. And they had all been turned over to the family, so she had to get them back from them. And fortunately, they had kept most of them. But there's just mostly loose papers, some sticky notes, not like nothing was in order, just kind of papers thrown into boxes. No addresses, phone numbers, no details on the people that they had interviewed. And she was just sort of embarrassed for them. So she told Mike that she was reopening the case. And of course, he hands over all the boxes of evidence that he had. Um, and one of the boxes contained one of her shoes, the phone, and the purse that were found in the car on the very first day of her disappearance. And so she starts going through all the boxes of evidence and all the files that the defense had in Bucky Brooks' case because she knew that they had hired their own investigators for the case because they were defense. So, like, the defense had their ducks in a row when the prosecution did not. So, in these boxes, she found Bucky's mental evaluation that determined that Bucky's IQ was 61. Now, polygraph tests are only relevant if a mental examination is done prior to doing a polygraph test because they require a mean age equivalent of at least 12. So a mean age equivalent, they're similar to IQ scores, but they take a little bit more awareness into consideration, such as your ability to understand the reasons behind questions and the consequences of their behaviors. So Bucky should have never been given a polygraph in the first place because his IQ score could explain some of his uncooperative behaviors and changing his story details and just everything about the way he behaved during the investigation. So Lynn is disheartened that they might never know who killed Jessica Dishon. So then she got a call from an old colleague of hers, Gary Huffman. Now, Gary was a detective with the Louisville Metro PD, and he often worked with convicted felons and would question them if he ever heard anyone like that anyone had admitted to a crime. Said they usually said no, but one inmate said that he knew who had killed Jessica Dishon. So Gary and Lynn interviewed this inmate. He was known as Inmate X, and he was serving time at Kentucky State Reformatory in LaGrange from 2011 until 2013. And he said that his cellmate had confessed to kidnapping Jessica Dishon, torturing her and raping her for 3 days before strangling her with a scarf and then leaving her body at the river bottoms. Now, normally inmate informants are not given a lot of weight with their stories because they try to leverage false information for some kind of deal on their own sentence. But Detective Lynn Hunt and Gary Huffman believed inmate X because he knew too much information about the evidence that had matched to Jessica's autopsy report. So, who was inmate X's cellmate? Well, if you do not know this story, I hope that you are sitting down. The other inmate was none other than Stanley Dishon, Jessica's uncle, Mike's brother. So the same uncle that had suggested the river bottoms was where the killer would dump a body. The same heartbroken uncle that had been so overcome by grief that he got sick during the search. Inmate X said that Stanley had killed Jessica because she told him that she was no longer going to keep his secret for him. Now, his secret was that he had been molesting Jessica while he had been living with the Dishon family while his brother Mike was helping him get on his feet and help find a job. Now, this inmate told Lynn and Gary that Dishon had told him in some conversations over this 2-year period that they were inmates together that he had grown jealous because Jessica had a new boyfriend and was afraid that she was going to tell him of their relationship, which you can't call it a relationship, but of what he was doing to her. So Stanley Dishon was in prison after being charged in 2002 for a sexual abuse charge and first-degree sodomy of 2 girls. They were 8 and 10 at the time. Now, at the time, he had entered an Alford plea. So he had contested the charges, but acknowledged that there was enough evidence to convict him. And so he had been sentenced to 10 years in prison on that. Now, here's a question. Why would sex abuse charges of 2 girls maybe not tip someone off at the beginning that perhaps Stanley should have maybe been questioned about Jessica's disappearance? Well, that was probably because that happened all right in the middle of this prosecution and trial of Bucky Brook. And it couldn't have possibly been anybody else, so they didn't even question him. So at the time of inmate X's revelations here, Stanley had nearly finished up his sentence and was supposed to be standing trial in November on charges of sexually assaulting a 12-year-old girl back in 1982. But his public defender and the prosecutor, Mike Ferguson, filed this joint motion agreeing to have the trial continued rather than put the girl through the trial. And so they would instead focus on this 1999 murder of Jessica. Michael Ferguson, who was this new prosecutor, he told the inmate that they were not going to get any kind of deal in order to testify. So he told Detective Hunt that Jessica had told him on the day of Jessica's murder that he had gone to the school to look for her. And when she wasn't there, he drove to the house, confronted her as she was getting into her car about to go to school about this new boyfriend that she had. Now, it seems that Uncle Stanley had been molesting Jessica during the time that he had lived with his brother and his family, and she was done with it. She was sick of it, wasn't going to have it anymore. She had a boyfriend that she liked a lot. She said she was going to tell him what her uncle had been doing to her. So Stanley knew that, of course, Mike would kill him. So Stanley hit Jessica, broke her jaw, knocked her out, and then he ran into the house, grabbed a bed sheet to wrap her in, and then put her into his vehicle, took her to an abandoned barn at a location where kids used to go and party, and he kept her there for 3 days, raping and torturing her before strangling her and dismembering her foot and fingers as a way of trying to make it look like a drug cartel had killed her, and then dumped her in the river bottoms where she was found 17 days later. Now, to make matters worse, during her investigation of this defense files that she had, Lynn found a letter from another informant telling the same story that inmate X had told was dated back in June 26th of 2002, which was during the Brooke trial. But it was never looked into at all. This inmate story was exactly the same as inmate X's, so they knew. Both the prosecution and the defense knew that Bucky wasn't the guy. And to further prove that Stanley had been the one that killed Jessica, Detective Lynn Hunt and Jessica's brother Bubby went to the area where Jessica had been found. They walked into the woods searching for the missing shoe, any evidence that they could find, and they found nothing. But as her and Bubby were driving away, they drive past this place, this barn, and Bubby says, just kind of conversationally, "Oh, that's where we used to go and party at." And so Detective Hunt says, stop the car, basically, outside of this barn. And when they went inside, they found a bed sheet that had been buried in the dirt. Now, Bubby thought it looked familiar, and when they went back to Jessica's old room, which of course Dad had left exactly the way it found that it matched the fitted sheet that was still on her bed.
We showed you a fitted sheet. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. And you verified that that was her fitted sheet that was on her bed.
Yes, ma'am.
So when the police interviewed Stanley, he refused at that time to confess. But the police said that he appeared nervous. He was kind of shaking. He said he didn't care what kind of evidence they had against him. He said he didn't do anything. Um, Now, Mike asked for the death penalty for his brother, and Wanda Dishon, who's Stanley's sister, she had called into the Courier Journal, and said, "Everyone is bringing judgment on my brother. I know he didn't kill Jessica. They all have him guilty before he has a trial." And then she said that her brother would never do such a thing. Our daddy raised us different. She said, "We had a daddy that was strict on us." Now, Wanda still believes that Jessica was killed over some kind of drug deal. During the investigation, they uncovered 3 other family members that were being molested and threatened by Stanley. And rather than put them all through a trial and having to testify, the prosecutor's office took a plea deal where Stanley would once again enter this Alford plea for manslaughter and 4 counts of rape. So again, he's not saying that he admits to doing it, but that there's enough evidence against him to convict him. And at that trial, Mike confronted his brother, and Stanley just stared right back at him. So Mike, he just completely dissolved into just absolute sobs, and said that he had let him into his home, found him a job, and that was how he had repaid him. And then in March of 2015, Stanley was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Mike says that Stanley still contacts him constantly saying he didn't do it. Mike says he knows that he's lying about it, because why else would he have taken the plea deal? But he does still believe that Bucky knew more than he let on to. And Mike said at the end of it, there was an A&E cold case episode about it. He said, "Stanley will be 77 when he gets out, and I'll be waiting for him." Now, Bucky Brooks did forgive the sheriff's department. He said that his wife, Irene, said on his behalf, "They are only human. They made mistakes, and I don't hold a grudge against them. We all make mistakes." Bucky passed away in his sleep from cardiac arrest in June of 2021. Now, there is a little after note in this story. It seems that this bit of a shit show in Bullock County has kind of continued. In July of 2015, Lynn Hunt filed a wrongful termination suit against Sheriff Dave Greenwell. So remember the rookie cop that had first come out to search Jessica's car? Well, he had been promoted to sheriff. And in her July 16th termination letter, he had accused her of telling a man in March that he should sue these 2 Louisville police officers, calling the men an obscene insult that they had done, as well as referring to the Bullitt Sheriff's Department as a joke. Now, he also accused her of being disrespectful to him and staffers, working off duty at a bingo hall without informing her supervisor, failing to show up for court after being subpoenaed, lying to investigators, and conducting private business on work time. Now, she is countersuing, claiming that she was fired without pre-termination hearing, violating state law, and the lawsuit was looking for unspecified monetary damages. And then there was a jury trial and a judge to sort of get have her reinstated back on the department with back pay. And I actually don't know how that turned out for her. Now, Sheriff Greenwell, he resigned in February of 2017. In May of 2017, he was charged with 4 counts of attempting to obstruct justice. The prosecutors said that he was part of a conspiracy involving about 2,200 pounds of marijuana. He had tipped off a Bullitt County special deputy who was under investigation by the feds. So he was actually facing the possibility of life in prison. But a jury found him not guilty in November of 2018. And that was the horrifying story of Jessica Dishon. And as always, thank you so much for watching.